I'm Chuck D'Antonio. I am lead the solutions engineering team here at Replicated. Welcome to the third in our series of deep dive conversations around the Replicated platform. This is a bit of a roundtable discussion where we're going to talk about the topic of virtual appliances and distributing your software that way. I have with me today Alex Parker, who is the product manager of our installers product area. And so he's responsible for the embedded cluster and a few other things. And then I have also Martez Killens from my team, who probably many of you have worked with, who helps lead our customers through the pre-sales process from a technical perspective. And I want to talk a little bit today about virtual appliances. But first, I want to say, well, what do we actually mean when we say virtual appliance? Because um, I think we have sort of a spectrum of virtual appliance definitions that we could work with. We could talk about a virtual Kubernetes appliance, which is essentially what happens when you package your software with the replicated embedded cluster. You're sort of bringing on along the Kubernetes bits that your application needs so that you can install it as an appliance. And then we have sort of a more traditional definition of virtual appliance, which um, is when you package as a machine image, an AMA, an OVA, whatever Azure and Google and Oracle and IBM call that. And your customer is getting that full experience of kind of like dropping in an appliance and getting started. Um, I'm going to start with a question to Alex around, um, as the product manager for installers here at Replicated, um, we talk about sort of the main thing you work on, our embedded cluster, as helping create a virtual Kubernetes appliance. What does that mean to you? And, what are your goals in terms of providing that appliance experience?
Yeah, so I think the what it means to me as far as embedded cluster being a virtual Kubernetes appliance is being able to package up all of the Kubernetes pieces and all of the infrastructure there to support Kubernetes as a single deliverable of your application. So you can ship not just your application, but also Kubernetes together as an appliance to your customers' environments. And so that has a lot of benefits as far as being able to abstract away some of the details that, if this person, this customer that you're selling to isn't familiar with Kubernetes, they don't want to manage a Kubernetes cluster, that's not their expertise, et cetera. By you packaging your application as a Kubernetes appliance, you're able to somewhat take ownership for those pieces and bring them into your application so that a customer that's deploying doesn't have to think about them, doesn't have to be familiar with them or manage them or things like that. And so for the customer experience there and for like the user experience that we're looking for, it's to really fulfill that goal of abstracting those things away so that they aren't something that that end user needs to think about. So if you're going to deliver a Kubernetes appliance to a customer that doesn't have Kubernetes, they shouldn't have to think about Kubernetes. They shouldn't have to run kubectl commands or know specific terminology that's specific to Kubernetes. So the goal really there is to just abstract all of that away and make it feel like, a layer up the stack. I'm deploying this application. I'm not deploying a cluster and this application. So they can focus on the thing that they are familiar with and that they did purchase, which is your application and not necessarily a bunch of infrastructure that they're not familiar with.
Awesome. When I think about focusing on the application, I think about how, um, as early as, you know, the pre-sale cycle, when you're, trying to prove the value of your software to your customer, um, there can be friction if you start out a POC and installation is difficult. And sometimes installation is difficult because of your application, and sometimes it's difficult because of decisions that the customer has made that you have not anticipated. And while you can respond to those, oftentimes that slows down your overall sales process. Martez, you work with our customers on proof of concepts, and you've certainly, before coming here, done many proofs of concept with other folks. Um, what's your feeling if you're doing a proof of concept and you start to run into these types of you know, little technical slowdowns, but they start to pile up.
Yeah, so typically that creates a lot of friction. As Alex was saying, like we want to get to the part where we can actually start evaluating the software. And when you kind of get these little friction points that continually add up, it just really kind of, degrades the experience ultimately that we're trying to get with the end customer. One of the things is this is their first experience with your software, and you want to have that initial kind of wow moment, like, hey, it's easy to install, it's going to, fit this narrative around what the software is doing for you. And if we can't get it installed, it just kind of leaves that bad initial impression. So we want to get to that point where we're not necessarily, as Alex was saying, fighting against underlying Kubernetes. We want to get past the points where we're kind of fighting against permissions, where we're not necessarily like pouring through documentation. And we just want to make sure that we allow our customers to see value really fast.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I'm sure it hasn't happened here, but in previous roles, have you ever had something where the opportunity just stopped right there, where you couldn't even get the POC off the ground?
Yeah, unfortunately, that has happened. Just lots of configuration issues, and then the customer comes a little bit disenchanted, and then, things just end up slowly pausing and slowly falling apart. So it has killed deals before.
Yeah. So, I mean, so it can slow it down and it can even kill it. So obviously, in that, for folks like you and I, or folks on a sales team, these issues can be, really critical, even though they just seem like, oh, these are little technical packaging details. Um, I'm curious of sort of, you know, what an ideal experience might look like. Um, I think about, um, I think about this, my iPhone, and that beautiful unboxing experience that Apple puts a lot of effort into. I'm curious, Martez and Alex, what does an unboxing experience for a software application look like that's as delightful as opening up an iPhone?
Hmm. Sure, I'll take the first stab at it, and I'm going to say opening up a Google Pixel Android-based phone. But no, just in general, I think that initial unboxing experience, starts with the experience itself. Like, I don't want to necessarily have to, if we're going to do analogies, I'm not want to have to like literally wrestle with the packaging. I don't want to have to go out and pull out like a big knife to open up the package and things like that. So if I can get to that initial point where it's easy to initially install the application, and we're typically talking about a matter of minutes, not
Hmm.
hours and days. We're talking about, potentially something that, in a perfect scenario, maybe it's a click-based installer. But if it gets a little bit more complex, the complexity doesn't, drive me to spending, copious amounts of time. I don't necessarily have to interface and interact with people across the organization. Like, hey, I got to put in a ticket over here to get access to this just to install your software. Potentially, it configures itself, kind of, has the checks in place to make sure that the path to installation is really smooth and easily guidable.
Yeah. So it sounds like those tickets to those other teams are kind of like having to go dig out that big knife. And Alex, so what do we do to help folks, not have to go take out that big knife?
Yeah. So maybe I'll start with I'll lead up to what I think is maybe the most important thing. But starting on the other end of spectrum, I think that Martez touched on a couple of these things, but having a guided experience that, when someone opens your software, when they start deploying it and they start interacting with it, it's not difficult to figure out what to do next. They're really guided through this process of here's what you need to provide, here's what comes next. And this for software, this can even, in some sense, start before the deployment. Where are they getting the instructions from? Where are they getting the artifacts from and things like that? And then obviously that continues through to executing those artifacts and running them and deploying them and all that kind of stuff. So I think for us, having an admin console based approach that lets people of any technical ability, any different background, kind of be walked through, a wizard of sorts that's going to tell them, here's what you need to do next, enter your configuration information here, kind of updating them on the progress of what's happening, etc. So I think having that GUI based experience that guides them through it, But one of the most important things I think in on-premises or self-hosted software delivery is pre-flight checks and ensuring that the environment has the right things to be able to support your application. Like someone like Apple delivering their iPhone, they can pretty much guarantee 100% success that if, you've got fingers and eyeballs and stuff, you can open their box and then turn the phone on. It's going to guide you through everything. But you
Although
you
they don't
can't
send me a
really.
charger anymore.
That's true. That's true. That's a big miss there. But with self-hosted software, you can't do that because your software necessarily requires certain things and a certain amount of resources that might not be met on the machine that's being used or other types of prerequisites. And so I think you can't necessarily install successfully at day one because it depends on what the customer is bringing and what settings are configured and whatnot. But what you can do is proactively alert the customer. These are the things you need. This is where you're out of compliance with the requirements that we have, and guide them towards success. And so that's something that we spend a lot of effort doing with our products like Embedded Cluster and others, is ensuring that our pre-flight checks are comprehensive and also actionable, that they're very clear that this is what's wrong and this is what you need to do to fix it. So that if I rectify the issues that I'm alerted about, I'm going to succeed on the next time. And I think that's one of the most important things, because what's going to kill your POC experience or whatever it is when they're trying to install software isn't just, oh, I didn't have the right requirements. That's fixable. It's something went wrong and I have no idea what it was. And what am I supposed to do next? And I have to escalate that. So proactively catching those things and telling them, I think, is one of the most important things to do.
And do you have a North Star for that time when all the preflets are met, right? From when I start to when I'm using the software. Do you have a North Star for what that should look like?
So I think for us, we tend to have a goal of having 95% of our installations get successful in 20 minutes or less. This can obviously depend on your software and what your requirements are. And if you need a GPU and the customer just didn't bring one, it might take more than 20 minutes to procure that, but hopefully they knew they needed that and did that. But generally speaking, our goal is that you're able to get successful 95+% of the time in less than 20 minutes.
Awesome. That's great. So Martez, if as someone who does proof of concepts, and I'm keying on this because this is the first time that these problems are going to be encountered. I don't mean to suggest that a virtual appliance only applies in proof of concept scenario, but um, you know, what does it mean to you if 95% of the time your POC is installed in 20 minutes or less?
So that's really valuable. I mean, I'm always shooting for the stars. So if we can get that any higher, the better. But like, I think that's just going to allow us to push deals forward, allow us to get to the meaningful parts of the evaluation of the software, right? And so that's the biggest thing. We want to kind of get to that point in any POV or POC that we're doing, to actually walking the customer through like what our software does, how it helps them meet their objectives. And so getting at that at 95%, just the initial, and if we think about like a pipeline where, hey, we start off at 95% and then over the course of time, we, meet other obstacles. But if
Hmm.
we're starting off at maybe 50% at the initial start of the POV, and then as you hit obstacles, then at the end of the funnel, you're not going to be as successful. So the
Yeah.
higher we can get that initial rate to, that's just going to help me prove value to customers in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. And I think it's important to me. One of my pet peeves at being in pre-sales is when my POC gets torn out to then do the real install. Um, yeah, all right, I'm having a moment now when I even just thinking about that. But and I think one of the things that, well, this is the first time we encounter that friction. This is a production grade Kubernetes distribution. This is a production way to run that application. So we can go seamlessly from that stage of evaluation right there on that same instance. And even if we have to maybe move up environments, right, from this sort of sandboxy lab environment to a staging to production, et cetera, um, I'm going to assume that all these same benefits hold that we're talking about in that first one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's part of a good POC evaluation is leaving the customer with, potentially actionable assets that they could use in a productionalized environment, potentially, or at least something that gives them a really strong path to getting there relatively quickly. Customers are moving really fast and they have these objectives that they're trying to meet. And so if like in your scenario, Chuck, if we do a POV and spend a certain amount of time proving this value, and then they have to start from ground zero in their next environment, and then in the following environment, that's not doing anything well, and then ultimately that's going to make your offering pretty much look brittle in my eyes, right? So
Yeah.
being able to recreate that experience across environments, do it rapidly, do it quickly, is definitely a win.
Cool. So what we're looking for is this delightful unboxing experience, right? Our customer, we didn't talk too much about the enterprise portal, but I think that starts there. Right? You go to the enterprise portal, you get the instructions for installing this virtual appliance. 20 minutes or less, you're up and running. And then you can carry that forth to your long-term production instance. Um, Sounds like that's our goal, right? That's our North Star. Um, so um, Generally, we're going to start with the embedded cluster as the virtual Kubernetes appliance. No Kubernetes infrastructure to manage. Great experience to install. Now we cover this sort of existing versus embedded Kubernetes cluster in one of the other deep dives. But for the people who weren't able to enjoy that one, Alex, can you give us a quick synopsis of what embedded cluster is bringing to the table that people aren't necessarily getting in a traditional distribution environment?
Yeah, so a few of the things would be one, obviously it's we're bringing Kubernetes along with the application in an embedded cluster installation. So if you have customers that are not familiar with Kubernetes, don't want to operate it, or you just find it easier to ask for a VM than a cluster and go through all of those, all of the rigmarole that might come along with going into an existing cluster. Embedded cluster is a great solution for those scenarios and being able to make it accessible to a lot of different people and streamline the delivery and installation process. I think one of the other benefits we talked about in a previous deep dive that I feel strongly about is that the embedded cluster option brings more things under the vendor's control and lets them have a lot more elevated permissions and access and things like that to do what they need. And sometimes people, software vendors can react adversely to that and think that that could be a bad thing, that, oh, so I'm responsible for the cluster, or I'm responsible for these things. Wouldn't it be better for me to offload those to the customer? But at the end of the day, if the cluster's down and your application therefore is not working, the customer is going to need you to be involved. Like they're going to say, this isn't working, I need help. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day who owns it. If your application's not running, that's bad for your business. And so you ultimately end up being involved in those processes one way or another. And the nice thing about embedded cluster is that now you're using a product that was purpose built for this, that was tested, where upgrades are built in and covering all of these different things, upgrading all of the infrastructure, all of the application components, letting you install things that require more permissions, maybe custom resource definitions that require cluster scope that can be more difficult to be accepted into an enterprise's existing Kubernetes cluster. So things like that, I think, put a lot of control into the software vendor's hands and let them deploy their application in the right way, the way that they see fit. And also can help them deliver that to a variety of customers, regardless of their background or experience.
Yeah, I think that's really important. That it is regardless of their background and experience. I think something I talked about on the previous session as well is, I was surprised the number of customer environments where there's plenty of Kubernetes expertise, but not in the team that's buying the software. And how that becomes something that, you know, you don't necessarily want to be dependent on another team to get your software installed and running, especially if you have the ability to not bring those other teams into the conversation. And so it really is, you know, even if you're selling to someone who you've seen, talking at KubeCon, people with their badge were talking at KubeCon, the team that you're selling to might not have access to that. So, um, and that was a sort of a lesson that I learned. Um, I know, Alex, that your team has been doing a lot of ride-alongs and discovering a lot of things that can go wrong, even when you do control the Kubernetes environment. And so this is where I think when we're talking about virtual appliances, that virtual appliances become something, um, excuse me, where you can use the full virtual appliance experience, the traditional thing you might think of, the AMI, the OVA. Um, what are, do you have any sort of like war stories of like weird things that happened on one of the ride-alongs the team was doing that might point towards, hey, maybe you want to control the operating system too?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that there have been, over time, I think we've really beefed up our pre-flights and are always trying to proactively catch a lot of these things and figure them out in advance and whatnot. But so like over time, there's been a lot of different kernel parameters that we have seen um, that needed to be set in a certain way for things to work. And sometimes that's not just for install either. Sometimes the install can go successfully, and then down the line. An
Hmm.
upgrade might behave differently. Um, or, for example, another thing we've seen is people that have infrastructure automation in place that will automatically change the configuration on a machine. So even if you need to make a change to have your stuff deploy successfully, if the automation is set up and does not know that necessarily, doesn't have that configuration in mind, it can revert it back into another thing. And that's a real example we've seen even recently where things were going well and suddenly things stopped working. We were trying to figure out why. And ultimately, it was because Puppet was being used to automate infrastructure and keep it in compliance with their configuration. So it was reverting the changes that were being made and kind of continually bringing it back into a state that would not work.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I
we
love
also
Puppet,
see,
I love Chef, I love Ansible, all of them. But if you don't tell the person running it that you need to make a change on this system, they're doing their job when they break your stuff.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think another area where this comes up, which is something we want to address in time, but people will have, hardened environments and, very stringent security requirements or things like that that might not work out of the box with embedded cluster with your application. And we have seen some of our customers be able to find workarounds for that maybe weren't something they wanted to have their customers have to do themselves. It sort of degraded the smoothness of that install to need to do X, Y, and Z things to make it work. But then again, if you sort of bring your layer of ownership down into the operating system and you have a virtual appliance like that, now you can control those things. So even if it's feels a bit hacky or feels not as clean as you want the install to be, that's now all packaged up in your delivery and abstracted away from that customer. So those are some other examples where people I think have found benefit in delivering that full appliance even down to the operating system.
Yeah. This is a real specific example, but I got a chuckle out of it. And those of you who are in the weeds will probably get a chuckle out of it. I was talking with one of our software vendors the other day, and they started out installing in our default location, right? Var lib embedded cluster, and then found out that their customer deletes all of var on every reboot, even though it's literally documented not to do that.
I hadn't
So,
seen that one.
yes, I don't think your software is going to work if it gets deleted every reboot. I mean, servers can stay up a long time, but um, so the move to from just here's our well, really, it's a full path, right? To here's our application, just go install it where you want. To here's our virtual Kubernetes appliance for you to install. To hey, we want to give you an entire virtual appliance to install. Um, does suggest potentially, right? It could be looked at in a way that like you're taking control away from your customer. Um, Kaylee, you do a lot of work in positioning. Um, so how do we make sure when we talk about this, if as we move down that path to sort of allowing the vendor to control the operating environment more, how can people message that around the benefits it has for their customers?
Yeah, specifically around like the benefit to the vendor, specifically around the benefit to their end customer, kind
Yeah,
of.
to their end customer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, I mean, I think a big part of it is what you all have already talked about today. I mean, being able to spin up a POC that then gives you really good assets so that then you can develop into a production environment. I think it all comes down to a lot of its time savings.
Mhm.
Also, I mean, messaging around security right now is unsurprisingly really popular, right? I mean, just showing how whatever tools you offer can help make your vendor's software more secure as it's installed, etc. I think those are really important messages to share.
Cool. Awesome. And as the software vendor, I might hear, oh, you just suggested a lot more work, right? I've got a Helm chart already, and now I need to build a virtual Kubernetes appliance, and I might even need to build a more traditional virtual appliance. Martez, what do you tell me if I'm scared of that?
So we obviously, or maybe not obviously, but we have recipes for you. So Chuck, you did a great job of kind of building out this image build process. And so I think we can help guide you on that path and that journey. And so just really quick overview of kind of like what that looks like. So you start off with your make file. We're going to actually spin up a temporary VM instance. We're going to do some hardening and customization of that instance. And then right now we can push that out to either AWS or either vSphere and OVA. And then we'll be able to distribute that image within your organization with whoever you give permissions to. And then I guess that second step is then the deployment process, right? So then you
Yeah,
go launch that AMI or that OVA, do the initial boot up of it, and then you should be met with your application at the admin console piece, right? So
yeah.
this is
Well,
not.
and you mentioned OVAs and AMIs. I heard someone might be working on this for Azure too.
Yes, that'll be me.
Okay. Um, Nice. So I really and taking a step back from that, even just going from my Helm chart to the embedded cluster, so I can have that initial virtual Kubernetes appliance. What kind of work does that look like?
So it's not complex at all. I mean, I think it's just a series of 3 to 4 metadata files. And then you actually just within your Helm chart embed the replicated SDK into your Helm chart, and then you're just about right there. So it's not a very heavy uplift at all. I've been on the journey with Replicated for about 5 months, and within a matter of hours, I was able to, have a Helm chart up and running inside of an embedded cluster, right? So
Yeah,
it's not a huge uplift at all. I think a lot of people would be surprised just how easy it is to get up and going.
yeah, yeah. Excellent. I think it was really a goal when I was putting together my work for image building, that it just be dynamic and usable right away, right? That you ended up being the proof point of that. You were the first person, I think, uh, at least that I had. I know some of the software vendors that we work with had made use of it as well, but you were someone who I was directly talking with and giving me the feedback as they did it. And it was great to see it working in your account and generating those images um and it really was I did build it as something that you could use sort of out of the box as if it were a product. Now I want to be clear right now, the things we do around building these machine image style virtual appliances are more it's more a recipe that our team provides that people can use down the road. I think there's some plans to productize around that. But we're trying to make sure that the virtual Kubernetes appliance solution is everything it can possibly be first. Um, the one other sort of question I think people might have about any of these appliance options is they might be a little stressed around updates, patches, etc. Um, So let's start with the Kubernetes level, where I have a virtual Kubernetes appliance with embedded cluster. Um, what happens when it falls out of date? Do I have to do anything with that cluster?
Yes, so absolutely. So you can do cluster updates as atomic updates with your application. So it's made really simple and really easy to do, right? So it's not going to be one of those things where you have to update your cluster and kind of, wrestle around with that process and then push out your application update. It's literally just a configuration file change. You bump up that Kubernetes version of the embedded cluster, then push that out, and then the cluster gets rebuilt, and then your application is layered on top of it.
Nice. All right. So, um, I think in the OVA model, I think maybe you get a little bit more. You have to take a little bit more responsibility, but I think especially in a multi-node scenario, if you do have to upgrade the OS, I would recommend just doing it by replacement, right? You upgrade the application, and which upgrades the cluster, and then at the OS level, you just basically swap updated nodes in and out, and you're good to go. Um, so, if you think about it now, I'm working from sort of one set of assets, right? I've got my Helm chart. I've got a small number of files that tell the replicated platform what to do with my Helm chart to build a virtual Kubernetes appliance. And then I've got a um, an image builder, that I can either steal from Truck or build on my own. That creates my overall virtual appliance, and it really all is centered around that replicated release. So we're able really to go out and meet the customers where they are, with each of those things. Um, so um, given that, with that flexibility, I just want to ask the whole room, right? How does that flexibility help a software vendor? Right? One
Yeah,
set of code, three ways to deploy, hopefully happy customers. But what does that give them other than potentially very happy customers?
I mean, a huge hope, right, is it just whatever new customer ends up in your lap, like it hopefully makes that POC process a lot easier. It makes the install process a lot easier because at the end of the day, like you don't have complete control over what your sales team is bringing in, and they could say we have this huge customer, they're super super excited about our software, here they are, and you don't want to say like we aren't prepared for their environment, you know?
Mhm. Yeah,
and I
I
think
can. Go
another
go ahead, Martez. Sorry.
Another really cool benefit is having, one source of truth to potentially meet your customers where they are. I think this is what you were getting at. And so I kind of put on my former application developer hat and just thinking about like, there was a time where we have to maybe compile for different OSs or well, sorry, you still have to kind of do that. But like if I'm targeting, say, different browsers and different things like that, like one, set of source for this browser or once, back in the IE 6 days and different things like that, right? So, now we're in this really cool spot where we can typically have one set of source code that can potentially, go out everywhere, right? And so having that single source of truth in your Helm chart that can help you go to embedded cluster that can help you just for a traditional Helm deployment or potentially this appliance like installation. It's just going to really cut down on the development cycles
Yeah.
and engineering cycles that your team has to kind of, work with.
Yeah, definitely. I think a unique angle that I haven't really thought about before is like finding a solution that makes your developers happy and makes your end customers happy doesn't happen very often. Normally
No,
what you need to build for your end customers is complex, and your developers are mad about it because they have to do all this special stuff to make it happen. But in this case, we're talking about like no, no, no. This will make your developers happy. It'll make your end customers happy. It's a win-win for two really important groups of people.
absolutely. We do have to start from the Helm chart, and that potentially has some disagreement between end customers and developers about that technology, but maybe that's just my own scars from having had a little trouble climbing the Helm learning curve. Um, but I like to think um, that having these different options really can change the sales conversation, right? As a leader in a go-to-market organization, you know, I look at anything that's even a little bit slower than the usual pace, and I start to get a little nervous. And then you get the ones that are a lot slower than the usual pace, and they make you really nervous. And so this predictability that this brings, you know, helps me feel like, okay, we're going through the sales cycle well. But not only are we going through the sales cycle well, but we're getting to the engagement and success post sale more quickly by being able to meet the customers where they are, right? The sophisticated customers can use Helm charts in their traditional deployment models. The middle of the road customers can use the virtual Kubernetes appliance. And then the environments with these more challenging constraints, let's say, that can use a full virtual appliance, and we end up with all that friction being reduced across the board, from the sort of early and mid stages of the sales cycle right through to long-term success and growth. So I think we've talked a little bit about the flexibility we get. We've talked about some of the things that are um, the friction that's eliminated. Um, I'm curious, um, are there any other thoughts or questions that the rest of you would want to make sure we cover in this conversation?
It's somewhat, I guess, adjacent to this conversation, but sort of a further extension of it. But I thought it might even be worth mentioning that, in this discussion, we're talking about delivering your application as a virtual appliance. And we've even had customers who went so far as to deliver their application as a hardware appliance and actually shipped a server itself to their customers with the replicated components installed on top of it as well. So just thought it was also worth noting that some people are even going a layer below that in the stack and shipping the infrastructure, depending on, particularly in places where the infrastructure is more specific, or people that need particular GPUs or really heavy duty machines. That's something we've also seen.
Yeah, and it's still starting from that virtual Kubernetes appliance, just being laid down on a disk in a factory somewhere,
Right.
which is wild to me, by the way. I mean, I know that that part of the industry exists, but it's just so out there to me. So, and there's a great talk from our Replicon conference. You can find it on our YouTube channel about that. Kaylee, Martez, any closing thoughts or remarks you might want to share?
No, I just think this is really compelling. Like I said, I've been at Replicator for a little over 5 months now, and just seeing the ability to meet your customers where they are, whether it be traditional Helm and all the way up to that virtual appliance, is something that has just kind of really been eye-opening to see firsthand. So, I'm excited to go on that journey and keep diving down that path with our customers.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's cool. This conversation was centered around virtual appliances, but also ended up talking about how a lot of the replicated functionality, once you set up a virtual appliance, it unlocks all these other options as well, which is very cool.
Yeah. And so, Kaylee, I think we have one more of these sessions coming up.
We do, yep, focused on using the replicated proxy registry.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you all for the insightful conversation. I really appreciated chatting with you today, and I'm looking forward to seeing how our experiences here continue to evolve.